Welcome to Smart People on Ice. I'm Alex Bennick. Today we're going to be talking about networking. I started my professional career following the networking industry, so it's always been a segment of technology that's been near and dear to my heart. And so it's a great pleasure today to be joined by the two co-founders of Cumulus Networks, Nolan Leake and J.R. Rivers. You know, it's a funny story. The first time I met Nolan and J.R. was at Hobie's off Stevens Creek Boulevard, and it was sometime in 2010, I forget. And we had a breakfast meeting, and I was so excited thinking about how exciting the opportunity they had laid out for me was that we finished breakfast. I got up from the breakfast and walked right out the door without even paying the bill. And I didn't realize this till I was about 10 minutes up 280. But fortunately, JR and Nolan, being the mensches that they are, went back in, paid my bill, and forgave me and allowed me to be a participant in the Cumulus journey. So we got off to a rocky start, so I appreciate you sticking with me all these years and doing this with us today.
Well, in the interest of looking out for your VC, you got to remember that you also had a meeting prior to our meeting, and we paid that bill too.
That is true. But so that's kind of current days on Cumulus, and we'll come back to that. But usually we kick these things off by going back in time a little bit, understanding how you guys kind of got into technology and networking in the first place. So maybe to you, Nolan, take me back to your youth, your early days with computers and.
So yeah, it's, my mother actually likes to tell this story because apparently I was kind of a slow learner. I was having trouble learning to read, and one day my dad came home with a TI home computer because they were discontinuing the line and selling them. And apparently, I don't remember this at all, of course, but apparently I learned to read very quickly because all of the manuals and programming guides were written down, obviously. So that's kind of the very early prehistory.
Yeah.
And then, I worked at a couple of startups all through high school, and then went to college briefly, dropped out in 2000, moved out here because obviously that was a hot time.
Yeah. Where'd you grow up?
Atlanta, Georgia.
That's right.
And then I, came out to California and worked at a variety of startups, and some of them got acquired into big companies, but I never intentionally worked for a big company.
Yeah, for sure. How about you, JR?
I think my first, you can call it real touch of technology came in high school. When I was a freshman, I took computer science classes at our high school, and we had these PDP-8s that you could program with these scribble-in punch cards, and then if you got really hairy, you could go in and do byte-level programming into in the machine language on the front panels where you'd toggle the switches, get the LEDs right, and push the button, and that's how you'd load your program. And those were pretty fun days. We wrote some fun, solitaire and blackjack games like everybody else in the world did at that time. Then as it came time for college, I had these great aspirations of being a psychology major or something crazy like that. And my father, who was in space and missiles in the Air Force, said, "No, I'm paying. You're gonna be an electronic engineer." I'm like, thought about it for a little while. And I said, "Okay, if he's paying, I'm going." So. I kind of took that path and got into college. Like most 18-year-olds, you don't 100% know what you want to do with your life.
Yeah.
But then once I was there, I started realizing how much I really enjoyed the technology. I went to Cal Poly in San Luis, so very much a hands-on organization. So we were doing, microwave amplifiers, big power systems, op-amps, audio amplifiers, writing computer programs, a lot of digital logic. So you're doing all these phases of electronics all at the same time. Sitting in the basement writing, for computer labs and programming in C and Pascal and all those good horrible old languages.
And in college, did you realize that networking was kind of the domain you were going to head off into, or it didn't really coalesce until afterwards?
For me, it didn't coalesce until afterwards. What I figured out in college is that I wanted to be in an industry where it was very systemic. There was hardware, there's software, there's applications, operating systems, very layered, a lot of analog, digital, all the different pieces mixed together. And networking obviously hits that market, pretty high on. I was, in retrospect, looking back, I'm pretty sure I would not have been happy just being a software programmer. Just writing everything in Java at really, really high level languages, very abstracted away from the whole system.
Yeah, no eye diagrams.
Yeah.
And so JR, after you finished up at Cal Poly, I know you went to 3Com for a bit, and then over to Grand Junction, which if people don't know was kind of one of the early seminal networking companies, a big acquisition for Cisco, which ultimately became the wiring closet, sort of fixed configuration switching business. I don't know how big that is these days, probably 6 or 7 billion, extremely large. Back in that time when you were thinking about architecting those systems, what was kind of the state of the industry? What was the observation? Was it moving from software forwarding to ASIC based, or kind of what were a couple of unique things about that architecture that stand out all these years later?
Yeah, it's kind of the evolution and maturity of technology, right? When I got into networking, at 3Com, and even in the early days of Grand Junction, or maybe just a little bit prior when Calpana was coming out, it was almost like the early days of telephone systems. If you look at how the classic telephone layout works, it's all based on manual switches and relays and A to D converters and all these really weird things, because that's all anybody could build with the technology. And everything kind of comes up from there. And so when in the very, very early days of hardware switching at Calpana, it was all about switching over 1 bit at a time. They had these little kind of bit by bit relays, kind of single bit wide path, and they'd kind of switch a 10 megabit stream based on address lookups. It was crazy stuff. And we at Grand Junction changed that whole world by parallelizing it and storing it in memory and all these super creative things. And so, you kind of look back then, and we were forging new grounds, as you said, kind of.
This was right about Fast Ethernet was happening at this time?
Fast Ethernet was coming on at the same time, and that was kind of the big piece. You had, regular old Ethernet, and Fast Ethernet was coming on. People were making the transition to Fast Ethernet, and also away from shared Ethernets to switched Ethernets. And the market went into this kind of very chaotic mode. It was super sexy for a little while. Lots of new companies coming on, everybody with their own kind of secret sauce on how to solve this thing. Then it became very chaotic because all of these pieces were coming to market. Customers and suppliers didn't know how the chips were going to fall. And then it went through a period of consolidation where a few players separated themselves out and became kind of the lasting entities, and the rest of them all just disappeared.
So Nolan, around this time, you did a couple of things, but ultimately ended up at VMware, I think around 2002, which was shortly after VMware launched the server products, right? So imagine probably interesting time, in that company's development.
Yeah, and it was a very, very exciting time for the company. Obviously, it was this kind of pivot into this new market that ended up, making the company wildly successful. I was primarily working in accelerated 3D graphics, building the kind of virtual 3D card for the virtual machines, which eventually became important to the server side as well as VDI took off. But also kind of worked around and did some security work and monitored. The great thing about the company back then, it was small enough that you could do pretty much anything. You were kind of pigeonholed. But even did a little bit of networking stuff, and that's where I kind of got the mistaken impression that a network switch is just about a couple of thousand lines of C code, and that's all it takes.
I'm sure you were quickly disabused of that notion. And then I know you went to 3Leaf because I remember meeting, hearing the 3Leaf pitch. From Bob Quinn when they were fundraising to build the SMP out of x86 machines. Which was certainly a very interesting technical challenge. And then this is sort of when your two trains intersect at Nuova. Is that right? Because JR, you left Google very briefly to be on the sort of early core team at Nuova, and that's where this team formed originally. Is that right?
Yep.
Ed Bugnon was one of the founders of Nuova, also one of the founders of VMware.
Right,
so he was very interested and sold me on the concept, and ended up at Nuova, and that's where I met JR.
And that was obviously a pretty interesting opportunity. Not every day you get called to help, get Cisco into new markets and, do some interesting innovations. So obviously those products have gone on to be extremely successful.